you to our plenary session, all of our good AAPOR members. As our panel knows, this is the American Association for Public Opinion Research, America's leading group of public opinion professionals. We're lucky to be having our annual conference this year here in the beautiful Crescent City of New Orleans, and it is a pleasure to have all of you here, both in the audience and our distinguished panel, for our plenary session. A few words, if I could, briefly, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cowen. The polls for the public good, as you well know, is the title and theme of our session this year. Now, the panelists may not realize this, but if you came to our sessions here, you would find a lot of our sessions are highly technical and professional. They're scientific sessions. For example, we have 7 sessions with 4 or 5 papers each focusing on nothing but the impact of cell phones on telephone survey research. You know, when I'm doing an interview, a lot of people ask me this question: how can you continue to do research when a lot of young people in particular have only cell phones and don't use landlines? Well, trust me, if you came to our sessions, you would learn every single thing possible about the implications of that for survey research. And a lot of other, what we would call internal scientific sessions. But the theme of this is what I think, and have written a book about, is critically important in what we do for a living. And that is how polls and survey research, which do nothing more than assess the collective views and wisdom of the public, how these polls and public opinion research can be used for the public good. And I think if we did our own survey of our audience here, professional pollsters, we would have a very large percent saying that's great. Polls should be used for the public good. People in charge, leaders, people making decisions, government officials should be consulting public opinion at all times to help guide the direction of the society or the state of the city where they live. However, we have learned over the years that not everybody agrees. I won't mention the name of our current president out loud, who's a good friend of Don's, but he has said publicly many times that he's not particularly enamored of taking polls into account and making decisions. And the Vice President Cheney recently was asked about polls, and someone said, what about the fact that the public thinks X, Y, or Z? And Vice President Cheney said, so what? And went on. So I'm all about nothing about those 2 individuals. There are a lot of Democrats who feel the same way, but it's simply by way of pointing out that there is not unanimous agreement about how polls should be used or the degree to which they should be used to govern and make decisions. But that's our key focus point here on our plenary session. The theme of our overall meetings is how public opinion polling can be used for the public good. Since there's disagreement on it, in many instances, we who do polling for a living have to deal with gatekeepers. We have to deal with the people like yourselves who actually are in a position to make decisions, and who are, like the examples I mentioned, sometimes prone to say, forget it, we're not interested in it, that's not going to be the basis of my decision. So what we're very fortunate to be able to do here today is actually have a conversation, and that's what this is, a conversation with leaders like yourselves to let us know. And we'll have questions from the audience about what are the impediments to using survey research, how could it be used, and how could it not. We are in New Orleans. Our contract at the American Association for Public Opinion Research to have our convention here in New Orleans was set, signed, legal, and delivered long before August of 2005. We're proud and happy to be here to help the city and the region in its recovery. But we said, as we pondered what we would do, this is a fortuitous opportunity for us to take advantage of this very compressed cycle that we have here in New Orleans between problem and solution. You had immense problems that arrived in one day in late August 2005, and you spent the time since then, you all in particular, in trying to solve those problems. So we have a compressed cycle that we said to ourselves, this would be a great opportunity for us to look at, all right, in this particular situation, what was the relationship between public opinion and what you all did in your various efforts to try to ameliorate, fix, and recover from the situation involved in Hurricane Katrina. And it turned out there's been an unusual burst of survey research that was actually conducted in and around Katrina after Katrina. So we, the membership here, and we'll go over that in a few minutes, have reviewed the research. We've looked at it, compiled it to some degree. You've seen some of that, and we've said, all right, there was research done. We'll give a few examples of the kind of thing that was available, and then we'll talk about what could be done to that point. We are very fortunate to be able to co-sponsor our session today with a wonderful institution. There are many wonderful institutions of higher learning, including Xavier University in New Orleans, but one of the preeminent ones, of course, is Tulane University. Tulane has been here since 1834. Is that right, Scott?
That's correct.
All right, I got the facts straight. It has well over 1,000 undergraduate and graduate students, and in fact, with well over 4,000 full-time employees, I am told is the #1 employer in the city of New Orleans. So not only does it have a cultural impact, it has a physical and economic impact. And we're very proud to be able to co-sponsor the session with Tulane University. And it is my pleasure to have gotten to know and to be able to share these duties today with Dr. Scott Cowen, who is the president, the esteemed president of Tulane University, and has been the president since 1998. Dr. Cowen was in place in August of 2005, and I think the statistic is, with the tremendous crisis that occurred by January of that year, Scott, 87% of Tulane students were back on campus after they had to disperse that fall. So it's a tremendous tribute to you and your staff at Tulane. So I'd like to give you that. So with that said, I would like to introduce to our audience here the distinguished president of Tulane University, Scott Cowen, and you will in turn introduce the panel, and we'll get started.
Good, thank you very much. First of all, on behalf of all my distinguished colleagues up here, I want to welcome you to New Orleans. People around the country always ask each one of us, what can you do for New Orleans? And the first thing we say is, come to New Orleans and come and experience this great city for yourself, and go back to all the other cities in the United States and tell them you had a marvelous time here, and this city is indeed recovering, despite what pollsters may tell you to the contrary. I am delighted that Tulane University is sponsoring this discussion today with the American Association of Public Opinion Professionals. I think it's a very, very important topic. And I'm delighted in particular that we have 4 distinguished panelists here, each of whom has played a major role in the recovery of this city. To my immediate right is Lt.Governor Mich Landrieu. Mich has a distinguished career in government, and most recently serving as Lieutenant Governor, where he was first elected in 2004 and then re-elected in 2008. Mich is the ambassador of culture and tourism for this state, but most importantly, he is one of the stars in what we call the Landrieu Galaxy. That's a name that's storied in the state of Louisiana, and Mich is one of those stars. He is one of the most articulate, passionate people for our city and our state, and I think you'll hear that for yourself when he has a chance to say a few remarks. Right next to him, thank you, please. Right next to him is Dr. Norman Francis, who is president of Xavier University. Norman also chaired the Louisiana Recovery Authority, the LRA, which was the group that was established after the storm to help this state recover from Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Norman, of course, did this as a volunteer, and he did an extraordinary job. And I can't think of another university or college president in America that could have done the job that he did as chair of that LRA for the last 3 years. There are 2 other things you ought to know, though, about Dr. Francis. He is the longest-serving university president in the United States. He is now close, if not there, to his 40th year as president.
Started as a teenager, is that right?
He was. He actually started that at age 19, so he's a very young man still today. He is also the closest thing that we have to a living saint in the state, because his contributions extend beyond just what he's done at Xavier University and, of course, for the state of Louisiana. And in recognition of that, President Bush this year awarded him the Medal of Freedom. So please welcome Dr. Francis. Next to him is Don Powell. Don has also have a distinguished career in government and in business, and this is the best gift that President Bush gave us, was Don Powell. And I think we all mean that. Don is by background a Texan, and he came in as the Gulf Coast coordinator, and as, if you will, the liaison between President Bush and everybody in our state and this region. And when Don first came, I think everybody was skeptical and maybe even cynical about someone coming into our region to help us. He just stepped down from that position about 3 months ago, and when he left, there's not a person that I don't know in this city, in this state, that doesn't say thank you to Don Powell for his extraordinary advocacy and contributions to the state of Louisiana and to our city in the recovery. A lot of the successes we've had has been that we've had a friend in Don Powell, both here in this state and in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Don Powell. And last but certainly not least is the great mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin. Ray is in his second term as mayor, and he has been asked to call to serve at a time that I think no other mayor in the United States has ever been asked to serve with the challenges he has had. He's born and raised in New Orleans, went away for some of his education, but I'm very proud to say when he came back, he has a Tulane MBA degree, and we are proud of that. And whatever successes that he has had, it is because of that degree. And whatever failures he has had, it's because he went to another institution as an undergraduate. But Ray has met all the challenges he has faced with a smile, with a thick skin, in an impossible job where no matter what you do, there's 50% of you that don't like what he's done. And he's done it, though, with grace and with great humor and with effectiveness. Please welcome the mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin. Frank, I'll turn it back over to you to get us started with some, pardon me? Oh, I forgot this. You were expecting Walter Isaacson and you got me. Walter, unfortunately, had an emergency that came up about 3 days ago, and he was not able to attend our session today. He apologizes for that, and he asked me if I would step in for him, and since Walter is one of my trustees and one of my bosses, the answer is yes. So there's no way that I could ever fill Walter's shoes, but as you look at me, don't think of Scott Cowen, think of Walter Isaacson. He is here with us in memory. Frank?
Thank you very much, Scott. Just to do a brief review, we would love here our professionals to do a technical review of every survey that's been conducted of the Gulf Coast region in New Orleans and Louisiana since August of 2005. You would need to be with us through Saturday, I think, for us to complete that, as we got into margin of errors and question wording impact and a lot of things along those lines. So we're not going to do that. But we did adopt as a project at AAPOR this year the decision that our membership collectively, a group of people, would get together and review what had been done, just so we had some idea of the polling and survey research that had been conducted. We call them CAPs now, K-A-P, Katrina-affected persons after the hurricane came through. We set up, and I'll show you in a moment, a website where people contributed and went on, and various of our professional analysts found the studies, looked again for studies. We think we've isolated every study that's been conducted and publicly released since Katrina up to the present moment. And we put them together and didn't do, as I mentioned, a 500-page opus about what it showed, but they did come up with some collective input. And we thought it would be appropriate, as we talk with you about how polling and public opinion could be used, to just do a kind of brief review of the type of conclusions that these studies reached. Again, not systematic, but let's look for just a second. You look down here, and we'll give you just a brief feel for the kinds of research that has been conducted, our field, what we feel is important that has been conducted since Katrina. This is example, this is a wiki site, just a screenshot of where we went, and our members came on and contributed, and various of us looked for studies, went on and looked for what they might show. We found studies out there, some of which you're familiar with, some of which you may not be familiar with. One of the first studies sponsored by CDC was a rapid survey of evacuees who were in San Antonio, Texas, which we think is the first survey that was conducted after Katrina within a week or two in September of 2005. We discovered that one of the major benefactors of survey research here in the New Orleans area is the Kaiser Family Foundation, which is headquartered in California. The directors of survey and other people who work on those surveys are actually members of AAPOR, I'm proud to say, and are here in this room and here in meetings today. They conducted a major, as you see here, post-Katrina baseline survey, and now they've been in the field with a second follow-up, and the data will be available this fall. There were other surveys. There was a group called the Hurricane Katrina Advisory Group that put together its own survey, and it's actually connected with Harvard Medical School, and those data were made available. CNN, USA and Today, and Gallup, having a news interest, worked with the American Red Cross and interviewed 1,500 evacuees who had applied for aid with the American Red Cross and analyzed those data. LSU has been very involved in doing continuing surveys of Katrina-affected persons, both here and in Baton Rouge, and various subgroups, and are doing so to this very day. ABC News is another example, jumped in a year later, in 2006, when it was the anniversary of Katrina, and did their own survey of people in New Orleans and the Gulf area. and the University of New Orleans Survey Research Center, which was, we understand it, very significantly affected itself by Katrina and found it very difficult to continue to do surveys, but they managed to do at least one continuing update on the survey research that they had been conducted, and so forth. So there are a lot of studies that have been done of various populations and various qualities. Basically, just to give you a very brief idea of the conclusions, there were 5 categories we think of responses that came out. Kind of like, you're familiar with the Maslow's pyramid, from the basic to the sublime, as it were. Clearly, survey research showed initially at the bottom there were physiological and safety needs came to the top. Representative conclusions. You don't need to memorize these just to go through quickly. Conclusions from these studies. In an immediate study, polling showed half of those interviews said they didn't have enough water or food to drink. It's what the survey showed. By early '06, we still found that 45% surveyed reported difficulty with health and medicine. In fact, LSU concluded that one of the major factors in determining whether a person would be back to New Orleans was the availability of health and medical care. Damage to one's residence is obvious, but was documented by the survey was a major factor, again, in these studies on whether or not a person was going to stay in New Orleans or not. Home repairs and housing, top of the list. Crime rate, which is a problem in any major city, was before Katrina, but continued to show up as a significant factor which could influence whether people move back. Money. You would be surprised the degree to which survey research uncovered the obvious, but that was that people were short on money, right? You can see one example real quickly which came through, and this was 5 or 6 months after Katrina. Respondents were still saying that the #1 related problem was lack of money. Setbacks in the ABC News poll, there was long-term financial negative impact. Look, government, you leaders, what should you be doing? #1 response in at least one survey was government to be more helpful in providing financial aid. The kind of thing we learned from evacuees, this is a survey of evacuees, type of assistance more than anything else. A third said they needed money in cash. Another evacuees, we all pulled out our credit card, but we were able to establish that this survey was that you can see the data there, that only 28% even had a credit card in evacuee shelters. A key factor in the surveys, psychological factor that came through in our brief review of the data, was the fact that people were extraordinarily worried about Katrina happening again. Major factor in whether they wanted to move back. What did the people surveyed in one particular survey most want government leaders like yourself to do? Prevent it from happening again. Rebuild the levees. Make sure that future preparations and speed up infrastructure construction. Prepare for the next storm. Public's priorities for the recovery effort. That's what they were telling us in the survey. Repair levees, pumps, and flood walls, and so forth. Then we call it, Maslow, the psychologist, called it self-actualization, public actualization. This is the fact that people wanted to feel that somebody cared in a public sense. 61% in one survey said they felt the government didn't care about people like them. 7 out of 10 were not confident in the federal government's ability to do anything. A year after Katrina, 8 out of 10 not rating the rebuilding efforts great. More than that, it was this sense that Washington was not in touch and Washington didn't care. It was not a priority for Congress or the President. '06, not a priority for Congress or the President. And even more recently, a study just released by LSU, for the citizens of Louisiana as a whole, rebuilding had dropped off the map in terms of what they felt the government should be doing, major problems for Louisiana, and what the new governor should be doing now that he's in office. Finally, good news. As we turn it over to the panel, we actually found a thread of very positive optimism among the people. 7 in 10 optimistic about the area. One study went into depth on suicide and found actually the suicide rates were lower than they had anticipated. Pervasive optimism, how's that a word, for the great people of New Orleans came through in a survey. Personally positive, this is one survey that's done nationally, not all that different from the rest of the country, so there was a lot of optimism involved. And finally, as an epilogue here, the survey showed that family, God, there were a lot of things that were important for these people in getting through, and it wasn't necessarily government, is what it found. In fact, LSU, and this conclusion comes from researchers at the Department of Sociology at LSU, really felt that it was a sense of community, perhaps more than what the government could do, that could really have an impact on what could happen going forth. Good news to hear, 2/3 believe it will be a better place to live in the future, and a lot of people, according to this study at any rate, felt they did want to come back. Now, as I said, we'll be here till Saturday if we wanted to look at these in depth, but this gives you gentlemen a feel for the type of research that was available. These studies were all publicly available out there, some of them tracking data to try to evaluate what the priorities were of the people and how they were feeling about the efforts that you all were involved in. And with that, come back to that, I think we're ready to talk about your relationship to that. Scott?
Let's talk about, let me ask two interrelated questions and ask each of you to comment. First of all, to what extent as leaders, and you're all very prominent leaders in the recovery, do you actively seek out polling data to help you decide what's going on? And then to what extent do you actually use it? And we're not here to comment about the pros and cons of that. What we are to say is I think we've got an audience out here who wants to know how useful do we find this data? And secondly is, if we find it useful, how do we actually use it? And maybe, Norman, we could start with you, if that's all right.
It's fine with me. I think it's working. We did not use polling as much as one might think in our work at the LRA. Let me back up a little bit. Our immediate needs were obviously to coordinate all of the efforts of people in their recovery area, coordinate it, but respect the cities and the parishes like the mayor of New Orleans would make decisions about plans and so forth. And in each of our meetings, every one of what I've just seen on this board, we had people coming and telling us, because we had open public meetings at the end of what work we had done, and all of these were mentioned. Money, levies. For a full year, I think all New Orleanians were worried about another levee break. And I think we're a little past that, we still are worried about it. My point in saying all this to you is that though polling is extremely important, the tack that we were using was the charrettes, the open meetings with committees, and a lot of people were involved in these various charrettes, City of New Orleans alike. In fact, 25,000 people were involved in the Louisiana Speak side. So my point is, we had that. We did not use polling as much as perhaps maybe we should have used, although I think the bottom line is, were we listening to people? And the question I think I can say is, yes, we were, to the extent that it was important. And I know I'm going to have a few other things to say, but let me just say, this was an event that was unprecedented. Nobody wrote the book on how do you go about it. The first shock is that you're knocked on the floor and then you try to get up. And we, I think, did get the involvement of people to the extent that polling would have, although we did have one organization, Policy Links, that did some work for us. Don't want to disappoint anybody, but we did get the results from people, but it wasn't from polling.
Mr. Mayor, how about, you want to comment on the usefulness and relevancy of polling and what the tasks you've had to undertake?
You know, Scott, I read a lot, and I'm constantly fascinated by this whole science that you're involved in. I'll be honest with you and tell you that I didn't always pay attention to the polls as far as from an implementation strategy, but it was part of the data sets and the information that we got almost on a real-time basis to help us get through this particular challenge that we had. The thing that always bothered me about the polls that were coming out right after the storm is that they seem to have taken the traditional pre-Katrina mode of trying to get information from certain data sets, and this was a totally different experience. We had citizens that were spread out over 44 different states. We had people that were pretty much shocked for several weeks in watching this tragedy, so it was very difficult for me to really get a feel for how relevant this data was initially. But then I started to notice the polls started to reflect some of the town hall meetings that we were having and the travels that we were doing around the country, and it started to come in line with the experiences that New Orleanians were having. You know, polls are great. I really love them. Some of the posters I don't particularly care for, but you know, the polls are great and they're great data points. I find it very interesting, and you should find it interesting, that in the midst of this incredible tragedy with so many people hurt and feeling the way that they are, they're now to a point and have come around to a point where they're feeling fairly optimistic about where this recovery is going. And I don't think people have really gotten into the depths of what are the dynamics that's driving that psyche right now. Because if you read the newspapers down here locally, which I wouldn't recommend you do that before you have breakfast, But you would think that people in this community were at a totally different place. And they are really much more optimistic, much more engaged, and much more into proving other people wrong and making sure that this recovery comes back and this city is better than ever. So I use your data, I appreciate it, I understand it, but it's a data set, and it has to be complemented with other input to really be effective.
Don, you had the task, of course, of linking together the federal government, the state government, the local government, so you're getting multiple perspectives of what's going on down here and the kinds of things. How useful is this kind of data in the job you had as Gulf coordinator?
Well, I mean, we saw lots of data. We would get data from think tanks, we would get data from local officials, we would get data from state officials, and then we would have poll data, and et cetera, and so forth. I would read that data because at the very beginning our office was charged with the responsibility of long-term recovery versus immediate relief. So some of the things that you saw in here were immediate relief issues as it relates to money and food and water and things of that nature. But we were more focused on long-term data. What I found when I would come to specifically New Orleans, I had points of reference. And I must confess to you, Dr. Cowen, that I would go back to those points of references on a very regular schedule when I would come down here. And they would be normal citizens. They would be citizens whose homes were destroyed. They would be public school teachers. They would be old people. They would be elected officials. They would be people from all walks of life. And at the beginning, I began to question myself a little bit whether that was really a good representation of what was occurring down here. After I'd been down here about 10 times, I discovered it was a great representation. So I would actually go to the people and ask them what was occurring in their life. That's where I would find out things, Dr. Francis, about the Road Home program, about how many times they had completed certain data. So my source of information was really live, were people that would go back to and see what progress or lack of progress that they were making. And I must confess to you, it was skewed not necessarily to elected officials or people that were responsible for decision making, it was ordinary citizens.
Mitch, you know, you're also in a unique role because as Lieutenant Governor, you represent the entire state. And of course, as a New Orleanian, you're one of us, and therefore you represent it. And you're an ambassador for culture and tourism here. So this kind of data, you must have been getting questions about this all the time from people outside the state who were thinking about having a convention here or doing something else. So how useful did you find all this?
Thank you, Dr. Cowen, and thank all of you for being here. First, let me just begin by just reiterating how important it is in our recovery for you to be here, because we do have two messages that we send. One to Congress, that we need a tremendous amount of help and we continue to work on the long-term recovery. Or, as the mayor requested yesterday to the governor, we need the National Guard to stay in town to make the crime situation straight. But then I'm also out nationally, internationally, sending the message, we're open for business. Come on down. The Jazz Fest is going to be great. We're going to do Mardi Gras, and we're going to have a great time, and you're going to be safe while you're here. And to some people, those are two separate messages. They're actually both accurate, and they're both necessary. The second thing I want to say is that there's no other place in America, I think, that is a better, what I call a laboratory of democracy. In other words, there's no other place that's struggling with rebuilding different ways, different approaches, a school system, a healthcare system, a emergency operation response system. And right now, what we've done basically, because the people down here are wonderful and are willing to do this, we've offered ourselves to the rest of the nation as a laboratory where the nation can really try to figure out long-term what they're going to do to fix New York, Chicago, et cetera, because we're all doing it all here at one time. Now, I learned something new today, which happens every day, that I'm a CAP. I'm a Katrina-affected person. I never heard that before, but it's, you know, it's actually something that's very interesting, because what was very unique about this tragedy that I don't think has occurred many other places is that the people who were the first responders, me, the mayor, Dr. Francis, Scott, we lost our houses. Did the policemen and the firemen and all the emergency workers. So, for example, when there's a catastrophe in another town and it just happens to be a house that's burning down or a block that something bad happened to, the next block can come run over and help it stand up. But here, all of the people who were responding were people who were part of the catastrophe itself. And that was very, very interesting in terms of how we all tried to respond personally and professionally. I would say about polls a couple of things. First of all, before I became Lieutenant Governor, I was a legislator, and I represented a district that had 42,000 people in it. And there was always this question that went in my mind: was I a representative, and was I supposed to represent the majority views of the district on a very hot-button issue, death penalty, abortion, whatever it might be, guns, the hottest topic at the time, or was I a leader who was supposed to reflect my own views? And that was a constant struggle that I always had. But now that I'm an executive, you actually get to the point of, well, are you supposed to follow the popular will or what the public thinks at any one point in time that's a snapshot? Or are you supposed to say, well, look, I have more information, I have more knowledge, I have a longer view, I understand how budgets go up and down, and how do you balance, you know, both of those things? So polling data, for me, is another piece of information. It's another, I know it's a snapshot in time at that moment. And I have to try to find a way to use that so that I can make a judgment about how it affects what the long-term answer is for what could turn out to be a very difficult problem that goes over time. One of the things that was interesting about the polls is that as I was traveling around the country, going to Houston to meet with evacuees, to Atlanta, going to Memphis, going to places as far away as Utah, we were hearing firsthand from individuals what their needs and what their wants were. And what was interesting is if the polls reflected what we were hearing on the ground, because we were seeing literally sometimes hundreds and thousands of people a week, that it was important to us to see whether the polling data reflected what we were hearing on the ground. And I'll finally say this. What was most interesting to me is that what I was hearing from people reflected who they were and where they were when the storm happened. Let me give you an example. If you lived in uptown New Orleans on St. Charles Avenue in Nashville, and your house did not get flooded, and you did not lose your car, and you did not lose your job, you were apt to be much more concerned about whether the lights were working, the street lights were working on Ferret and Jefferson, than if you lived in the 9th Ward and you lost your house. You were concerned about different things, like I don't have a home, and you were hotter about it. And so if you extrapolate that and look about statewide, if you lived in Shreveport, for example, as empathetic as you may have been, as much as you would have opened your home, and as the polling data now reflects, where 3% of the people of the state now think it's a top priority, when in fact it is an absolute national priority, you know, it depends on where you were and what happened to you and what that reflects. So we have to look at that polling data and understand that, and then kind of use judgment about, for example, from a budgeting perspective in Baton Rouge. The mayor was there yesterday for New Orleans Day, trying to talk to the legislators and making sure the folks in Shreveport and Monroe and Alexandria and Lafayette understand that nationally this is still a priority and that it should be for the state, even though only 3% of the people in the state have put it at the top of the list. You know, so it's very important to us, but it's certainly not determinative of decisions that I make as an executive, and that has been true for the past 5 years that I've served.
Frank?
An interesting question, and we are going to, by the way, open this up for questions from the audience, right, Scott, in a bit from our posters. I think the members in the audience here would reflect on and be sensitive to and aware of some of the comments that we heard you all saying, which is what studies have shown that elected representatives in Congress and the Senate also say, which is basically, I know my district, I am in touch, I do understand the people. You know, we heard Dr. Francis, you said you had town hall meetings where citizens came, and we heard, Don, that you said you had individuals that you would go talk to on a basis, and we heard, Mayor, you're saying that you were in touch. Obviously, you were walking the streets, so you had a tremendous amount of that type of anecdotal or informal input. But what we're about here as professional posters is science. And the whole fundamental basis of what we do is that this type of more casual attempt to understand what people are thinking, feeling, can often lead one astray. Not always, but it can. And the reason that we have this extraordinary attention that the people in this room pay to how do you do scientific representative sample that is projected to a large population is for the reason that sometimes in anything larger than a few hundred people, you may not understand. It's the vocal people that come to town hall meetings. Typically, a politician will tell you, and my wife is on the school board, you hear from the people who love you and who hate you, but there's a vast middle that don't bother to get out of the chair. So I think, and we may hear this question to the audience in a few moments, but Mayor, maybe you could respond first. What about the essence of the science of polling? Don't you think that that might have some value if you could assess it more systematically on an ongoing basis and have a real feel for what's happening on a tracking and ongoing basis rather than the more casual feeling for what's happening. And by the way, I won't ask you, but two people here have run for office. Our assumption always is that you hire and use professional pollsters when you run for office and pay a lot of attention to them. So it's always been ironic that people would pay pollsters when they run for office, but when it comes to making decisions, they say we don't need pollsters.
Well, look, I don't know if I didn't state clearly what I was trying to get out. I respect the science that you do. Before Katrina, and probably a little bit after, I would at least go out every 6 months and do polls and track trends on attitudes, job performance, you know, different things that were going on in the city. But then Katrina happened and the world changed. And what caused me a little pause as it relates to the science is, you know, were the samples representative of the people who were in the diaspora initially? And then secondarily, were the emotional levels of the people who you were surveying really giving you a sense for where they were at that point and where they were headed? So, and I think all that has now settled down a lot, where the data and the results, obviously I like the fact that, you know, only 23% of the city right now are basically saying that the city's heading in the wrong direction. So for me, that's a good poll. I like that poll. Y'all keep those coming, okay? And we'll pay good money for them also.
I too respect the science of the polls, and I think it's important that you look at them. We were focused, though, however, in our office on the federal response to the long-term recovery. And I can assure you my first 30 days, 60 days on the job down here, there was one issue. And I'm not sure what the polls were saying about that, but it was clearly, and part of your polling data says that, it was the levees. I remember telling the president there were 3 issues in New Orleans, unlike Mississippi and unlike parts of Texas. It was levees, levees, and levees. And without the levees and without the belief that the levees were going to be rebuilt and safe, really everything else followed. I mean, everything else was academic. The reason we're here today is because the levees breached. And unless we spoke to the levees, so a poll, very frankly, as relates to them, one, I knew that from the cab driver to the guy at the hotel, to the barber, to everybody knew that the levees were important. That's not to say we didn't look at other things. That's not to say we don't appreciate the science of polling.
Yeah, exactly. I do want to speak to this issue because I believe in the science of polling. I commission polls when I run for office. I use them extensively, and I find them to be very useful as long as you use them for what they're supposed to be used for. And I think that if you have a good pollster and you have a good sample and the science is right, it can accurately reflect what the people are thinking about at that time in response to the questions you ask. That's why you spend so much time designing the poll. But there's nobody in this room that would do a poll for me, and I said, okay, well, tell me what they're going to think next week. And you would say, well, I can't do that because I can't predict what they're going to think because something might change. The other thing that you can't do is because you're limited by time, because you're limited by money and how much time people will spend on the phone with you, is get in depth into what's going to happen if the following things occur. And this is self-evident to all of you. You know this. When President Bush, #1, was determining whether or not he was going to run for re-election and whether Governor Clinton was thinking about running against him, I think George Bush was at 91% after the Gulf War. Somebody made a determination that they could win that election and made some guesses about things that were going to occur, and they actually turned out to be right. When we started the war in Iraq some years ago after September 11th, the public was way up here, and now they're in a different place. And one of the things that I feel like I have to do as an executive and other elected officials too, is you have to make determinations not about just how the public feels today, but if they knew what you knew, or if they saw what you think you see, and bases that you use to make long-term decisions that may not affect anything for years to come, what is the right thing to do based on whatever your set of principles happens to be at that time, and every elected officials, and I know executives is different. And so it is important data, but if you really ask me honestly, does that drive the decision based on what was said yesterday by a sample of 600 people I would have to say it's a piece of information that's used and hopefully used at the right time, at the right place, for the right reason. But it's valuable and it's necessary and it's probably accurate.
Let me segue into that to make sure, and I'll take a very short time. I totally agree with the science of polling and the like. It's a useful tool for decision making and the like, but it's only one part. And when I was asked about excuse me, my role at LRA and our work in coordinating it, we were getting data, information, we were following federal rules, regulations, and the like, and we had to have a lot of information. Polls were coming out later, and the old wolf at the door, we had a wolf at the door every day, and we had committees, and I think we got a very good, quote, response from the people in order for us to try to make decisions regarding what it is that we had to do. And I want to say something, because this is very important. I think, Mitch, you've already said it. Almost all of us, I included, lost my home, lived in it, raised my children, moved 3 times. I could identify with everything that appeared before us because I had experienced it. Now, that doesn't mean that I followed the decisions we had to make, but I don't want to give you the impression that we were not hearing what I call the cries of those who had the problems that have been listed here, because they were important to us. But I think what was very important, we had a number of things that we had to put into the cycle, and I think we did. But don't take anything I say that I would be personally against polling, not at all.
Let me ask one last question before we segue to another part of, I think, Frank's questions to us, or some data. We've all commented, and I certainly would agree because I was here, that this was such an unprecedented and unusual event in American history that unless you were here, it is hard to imagine what life has been like for us at that time and since then. It may suggest, and I want to ask the question, that with the benefit of hindsight, is there a lesson you would say to all the pollsters out there to say, you know what, using the same methods, good scientific inquiry, I would have asked you to rethink a little bit about how you did your polling at that time, so it would have been more useful? Or is it the fact they did what they did, and they did it very well, as they always do? We have to go on because we have serious problems and issues, and as Norman said, we're fighting with an issue every single minute. So is there any advice or lesson that you might suggest to the pollsters out there that, God forbid, and I say God forbid, there's another event like this, you might do something differently? Anybody got a thought on that?
The only thing I can think of is that one of the things that we did was very helpful was we got with America Speak, I think is the right group, and they did some sessions with us where we brought some citizens in that were representative of our pre-Katrina population, and then we had simultaneous broadcasts to like 4 or 5 key cities around the country where we had a significant number of Katrina related, what y'all call them, KAPs? KAPs, because Katrina affected people. And that was very helpful because it allowed us to get a perspective from a polling standpoint, and we did various tests, both what people were thinking who were local in New Orleans, as well as some people who were dispersed around the country. That's one thing I would suggest to you. And the other thing, I don't know how you do this, but there were so many competing polls and so much data that was coming out, and it was hard to determine who was credible and which data you should listen to. And I don't know if you have a rating system or, do you kick people out if they do bad polls? You got to figure something out because that was very hard to assess.
I will notice this as well. The mayor makes an excellent point. There are people that have ideological bents in this country. You have liberal think tanks, you have conservative think tanks, and they all want to push a national agenda one way or another. And it appeared to me that some of the polls were, you could tell if you really thought about it, who was actually doing the poll. For example, should the private sector rebuild New Orleans? And should we do it with tax credits, or should the federal government come down and give everybody a bucket load of money? What's the relationship between the federal and local governments? And you have all these think tanks that are planned down here now, and there are some polls, I think, that reflected their viewpoint. And so there have been times in the paper when you'd had 2 or 3 polls that supposedly was speaking about the same issue but came from a different perspective. That's the first comment. The second is this, and all of us up here have had this experience because we've asked many, many congressmen and senators and business leaders to come down here. And this is a very common experience. A very important person would say, you know what? I didn't understand until they saw it. Now, there was a person that had an opinion about it, and then when they hit the ground within 15 or 20 minutes, saw the reality and said, I didn't quite really get it. And so maybe my suggestion would be, and I don't know how you do this either, that when you're polling on something like this, that you have a real sense of what it actually looks like on the ground and what it feels like. I think you guys are used to operating in big numbers scientifically, and you can, but we have neighborhoods here where the reality was different from block to block. And as I said, people experience different things depending on what block they were on. I don't know how you measure that, but that's how intricate the pain was down here. And I think when national news organizations picked up the differential, for example, the difficult issue we had on race, but not many people know that the land in St. Bernard and the land in Lower Nine, separated by a railroad track, is exactly the same. But we had a big issue about, well, what happened on one side of the railroad track versus the other, and we had a lot of polling data about how people felt. Did the levees get exploded, or was that really just a mall that blew up because of a gas leak, based on what people thought versus what they saw and what they knew? And I don't know how much any of you actually knew about the intricacies on the ground when you were asking the questions, formulating the questions, who you were asking things to. And that's why I think Dr. Francis said, and Chairman Powell and the mayor, one of the things that we had to rely on, even though it may not have been scientific, was actually what we were hearing with all of the touches that we were making with the people that were affected by it, that I think had something to do with at least some of the decisions that I made.
I would just make one thought, and we're in New Orleans, and when you think of Katrina, you really think of New Orleans, but southwest Louisiana, as a result of Rita, was devastated. Mississippi was devastated. And you can ask the same question in southwest Louisiana, and you can ask the same question in New Orleans, and you can ask the same question in Mississippi. And I would suggest to you that you're going to get different reactions. Cultures, individuals are different in different places. When I would go to southwest Louisiana, it was a different environment. Devastation was unbelievable. New Orleans had a different environment because of its history and because of the culture here, as well as Mississippi. Each of them had unique challenges, and I think it's not one size fits all. So I think each of them, I mean, you think about New Orleans, this was a city that was underwater 60 days. 60 days. That's hard for me to imagine.
I'd like to give you a little preview of what we're going to do now. I'm going to ask Frank. Frank has another set of observations for us that I think he wants to share from some work that you've all done leading up to this meeting. And we'll ask each of our panelists to comment on it. I'd actually like to do all that in about 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'd like to use the rest of the time for you to ask questions of our panelists. And I'm giving you that preview so you could start thinking of your questions. Your questions do not have to be restricted to polling. You have an unusual situation here that very few people who come to New Orleans have. That as you have four of our most distinguished leaders in our community who have been through the recovery. So it would be a shame to limit you in your questioning just to polling. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about that. So when the time comes, we could spend the last 20 minutes with direct questions. But in the meantime, Frank, share with us some more of your observations.
Yeah, it's really just one observation that I wanted to share with you and perhaps get your reaction, and it's just to follow up on what we were saying before. In the course of our research, we discovered a very interesting website, which you may be familiar with, which I think gets some support elsewhere. If you can see it there, it's the Greater New Orleans Community Data Center. And we looked into that and we said, this is actually a pretty neat website, because what the individuals involved here have done is they have compiled data from any source that they could come up with, including, and you can see it right there on the front there, they go to the post office and say, can you track for us exactly how many addresses that you were delivering mail to, which I think is a pretty good indicator, these people think, and you all would probably agree, of the recovery of the population in this area, the parishes that involve New Orleans, and as you say, Don, perhaps Southwest Louisiana. Also, it tracks the number of kids in school down to the student. It tracks the dollar amount that's been spent for FEMA. It tracks everything that they could come up with is tracked in here that's available for people to look at. Now, those of us that worked on the project said, this is great. We looked, we hit, we looked, and nowhere in here could we find, unless it's hidden, anything about the attitudes of the population of the city of New Orleans. We did not see, and we might have expected to see, some kind of tracking about, optimism, ratings of the efforts of the government, number one priorities, what people should be working on, what would be the next priorities, even tracking of evacuees, and you've talked about all the dispersed people, what they might think. None of that was in there. So our question from this really is not so necessarily why that wasn't done, but with this kind of thing, ongoing assessments along these lines, which is what a lot of us here are involved in, attitudinal. Same kind of thing we do, as you know, job approval rating for President Bush is out, every week or two. So we have an absolute superb record of what people think about the federal government in that sense. We have an absolute excellent at the national level track of exactly, are we on the right track or the wrong track as a nation? We have an absolute track across many studies of what's the most important problem facing the country. We have an absolute track of attitudes, what should be done about the war in Iraq now. We have an absolute track of a variety of very positive, I think, indicators at the national level, but we don't. In this incredibly important situation, it's simply non-existent. So I guess from the pollster's perspective, I would ask you all again, in a reiteration, would that be a fact? Would you contemplate commissioning some kind of ongoing tracking of specific populations so that you could have just as you track the population of New Orleans as it recovers from its 400 to where it is now, back up to that level, to track the attitudes and the priorities of the people. So let me have you respond.
Well, I will.
What I think we would say in this room is it's missing data.
We thank you for and accept your offer to do that on a free basis for us for the next 24 months. We would love to have it, and it would be useful to all of us if you would do that. That would be great.
Well, I'm sure there is money. All of you had money for recovery. All of you had money for recovery, billions of dollars in some instances. None of it looked like
he's hustling business for pollsters right now. I can't believe it.
None of this money, apparently, or very little of it was, a little sliver of it was channeled over to an ongoing assessment.
Well, actually, first of all, I think that's Allison Plyer's. She's executive director, and what she has been doing, I believe, is accumulating data that has been put together by other organizations and bringing in the work. So if there is polling data out there, it would be great if she could take the work that you guys done, but that don't misrepresent what or misunderstand that is their work of accumulating work that other organizations have done. And by the way, it just points out just something you and I talked about before we came in. Polling data tends to be a person's view of reality or where they are or their feeling, as opposed to measuring objective reality. The data points that are in that information are excellent and they're necessary for all of us. How many people are back in the city of New Orleans? Can we measure that? That's really important for many, many reasons. How many schools are up? How many hospitals are up? How many clinics are up? Those data points, I think everybody up here would agree, are things that we pay a lot of attention to every day, and being able to measure that objective reality is absolutely critical. And again, I think that what's interesting about people's feelings is important as well. But I will point out to you a data point that's interesting about Louisiana, and the pollsters who are from here can tell me whether or not this is consistent with the way people in other states feel. But if you could ask people in Louisiana, you can say, look, your infant mortality rate's not good, your mortality rate from cancer is not good, your scores on your readings are not good, but how's life? People in Louisiana say life's great. And the fact that polls reflect that people in Louisiana have a special way of looking at life even when they're in difficult circumstances, because our sense of community is very strong. What may go to Chairman Powell's notion, I don't know how somebody else in another state would respond to that same question given the same set of circumstances. And you may have to find out when you're thinking about what to do going forward, whether or not the people of Louisiana approach life from a different perspective. I don't know the answer to that question, but it is curious to me when all of the polling data on those objective indicators indicate that Louisiana isn't doing well, that the people of Louisiana feel pretty good about living here. And that's just an interesting thing to note for me.
I think from my perspective, I don't think it would be useful. I think it would be interesting data, but we were focused on 4 areas, and we were focused on those every day when we woke up. And we believe that our primary job and mission every day was to attempt to complete those 4 areas. So from the federal standpoint, now if I were the mayor or if I were some of these other folks, I think it would be very useful, but not from our perspective.
When we talk about data for us and the work that we were trying to do in coordinate, it was extremely important. But I was sitting here and trying to ponder your question, Scott, and being a cap, I wonder what I would have answered if you had interviewed me 6 months, 2 months, 3 months. I noted in reading the reports and the like, there were several strands in it. First of all, the initial, 5 days, Mr. Mayor, give or take, the people who were stranded, rooftops, saw their families die, were rightfully so very angry at the government. It set the tone for a lot of months about what the government did not do for them. So that was a real personal thing, and I'm not trying to take away that should not have been, but it was. So that whenever you mention the government, that was a bad word for the longest, even though there were good things that were happening. But again, I don't want to ask for your sympathy and the like, but it's hard to describe to you the emotions and what happened for people who had lost everything they had overnight, and that they had no prospects of what the future was going to be. And it's coming back to your question. It depends on how you ask them, quote, their feelings, number one. The data one, getting the absolute numbers and all that we needed and the like. But looking back at it and then reading the report, I understood some of the answers and still understand the feelings out there because of the slowness. And this issue about not caring about us, we got insulted from the first 2 weeks. 2 weeks when members of Congress stated things like, you shouldn't live close to the water, and didn't come down to see what had happened. That hurt. It hurt for those of us who had lost everything. And I'm talking, the waters of Katrina did not discriminate in terms of the income levels and like. It hit everybody, and it was touching and the like. And so in answering the question first to you as to what would be done in the future about how you ask after a major disaster, I'm not so sure what the answer to that is. And the second one, yes, it is good for us to know what is in fact the thinking of people, and they're going to be, as Don Powell said, very different. But it's good to have the information to put it in a context as we go forward, and I think that's extremely important. I have to say this. Somebody said to me, well, you know, you've been a president 40 years. When are you going to write your book about education? Well, I think I'm going to write a book, Don, about the politics of recovery. I had a front row seat.
I'm going to be very quick. I think some attitudinal surveys would be very helpful now. And I also think it would be great to go back and kind of connect the dots on the work that was done. It's out there. I don't know why it's not on Allison's website, but there was some work that was done. But going through this, the past 2.5, almost 3 years, I don't know if I would have wanted to have it, because I knew people were very upset. I knew in most cases they were still hurting from Katrina, and I didn't know whether that data would be very helpful, and I had to trust my instincts as a leader and really make some tough calls that probably were against the sentiment of many citizens at the time. But now that we're to this point where we've got over 70% of our citizens back and the economy's in a much better place, and we can look back now, we can see the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think we're okay. But if I had attitudinal surveys at the time, it probably would have distracted me, I think, because my gut and the other information that I had told me to do something different that most citizens probably didn't appreciate, and they're just starting to understand and appreciate now.
What I'd like to do now, if we could, is to turn the floor over to the people in the audience for your questions. The lights are blinding me, but I do understand that there are microphones out there. And if there are, could you please go up to the microphones and just state who you are and ask your question to whomever you would like to ask it, if not all the panelists. So, Frank, do you actually know where the microphones are out there?
There's one.
All right, thank you. So it always takes one brave person to go up first to ask the first question.
Hi, I'm Rick Weil. I'm in sociology at LSU, and some of that stuff, was from me. I want to say there's a little bit of a tug of war going on here, which my response to it would be sort of stop, you're both right. Because I think that there are uses of polling that are very informative and very helpful for policymakers. And the general approach to that, I think, is how to use your very scarce resources to find the gaps. That's sort of the first part of it. And the second part of it is if you approach it in a structural way rather than a horse race way. If you're running for office, you're breaking it down, and you want to do something similar. By the way, I've been working a lot with Allison Plyer, and we've been talking about putting some of the polls on the CDC website. And they're funny because they're very thick, but they're very thin from consistency. So here are just 3 examples. And our polling, has included evacuees and people who have come back. One of the things that we found is you probably know that there are not a lot of medical facilities in the East. And we have found that medical concerns are much higher in the East. So if you have limited resources, you're going to pay doctors anyway. What about opening a couple of clinics, say, at UNO or Southern there, where you may have rooms, you're going to pay the doctors anyway, so put them in there, and it would encourage people to come back who would not otherwise come back. We get this from the polling. That would be a policy decision you could take. Second one, we're going with PolicyLink. You mentioned we're going in the field this weekend with PolicyLink. There are gaps, various kinds of gaps. What do people need, and what's the biggest bang for the buck? What can you, in the cheapest way, do that will have the biggest effect? And that's not just opinion stuff, and it's not just whatever. It's trying to isolate where you can really get your resources to do something. Third one is community strategies. I've done a couple polls now with the Jewish Federation. We've worked with lots and lots of community groups here. Different communities, you probably know the effect of communities is probably as big as anything else, and the different strategies that they're pursuing. So we're actually trying to bring some of the community leaders together to compare notes and look at different strategies for what's actually working, and then we can see the effect of that with the polling within the community, and we can also give the results of the polling of the community to the community leaders. And I think that that's also effective where they can see how to get the best bang for the buck. So I think you're both right.
Is there a question here? Or do you want just general reactions to what you said?
General reactions.
All right. Anybody have a reaction to?
I want the reactions. I think what Rick was saying is pointing out a little more specifically some concrete examples of how polling might be used to determine spending and other decisions.
And I think Rick, right? I think you brought some great points to the table, and if you could write me a little 1-pager on that or whatever, 2 pages is fine. If you really want to elaborate. But what I'm trying to convey to you is that we're at a different time and space in this recovery, and we're now to the point where we kind of take a breath, a deep breath, and figure out strategic ways to better use your data, polling data, that gets to the citizens' needs in a much crisper manner. But when we were in nuclear crisis mode, we just didn't have the time, the energy, no other attention, and we're suffering as KAPs anyway, on a lot of different fronts. So I'd love to talk to you more about that, because that sounds very intriguing.
Thank you. Right over here, there, the question.
Hi, I'm Fran Featherston. I'm with the National Science Foundation. We collect data from your universities about how much scientific research they do. But I want to ask more, I want to take Scott up on his offer to ask more personal questions. And as we got a room full of people here, we're all going back home, we're all going to tell them about New Orleans. We can't get them all to come here. Which charities should people write checks to that you think have used the most, been most effective about using the dollars that people donate to them? That's my question.
That's a tough question. First Xavier and then Tulane. It's a tough question in the sense that so many people have been involved. There are communities. Take the Broadmoor community, as the mayor knows, folks got together and the like, and they could use monies very well. Habitat for Humanity, all the rest. Let me make sure I say this correctly. What I would want you to do when you go back home is to understand, and I'll get to the answer to that other question, because the Louisiana Recovery Disaster Fund is one that does receive funds from private sources and then redistributes those to very worthy causes that they know about that are in great need in the state. But it's very difficult to say that we don't have money. I think the angst right now is, and the mayor has said it a couple of times, how do we work through the bureaucracy of money that's there? And I don't want you to take from this that we don't need money, but the angst that you're getting from the polling is that things should have moved faster than they have moved in these latter stages, and more should have been done, so that money is needed. But there are people who do need money, who are not going to get it funded by the government or other sources except for private donations and the like. And I think that the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Fund is one coordinated group that does redistribute monies. I think of one in particular right now, is Representative Sexton, who's helping families that have been displaced, families that are separated and the like, and they do not get state monies or federal monies. And the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Fund would be an ideal one, so that could be given to the people we know are actually doing the work.
Real quick, the biggest one for me right now is homelessness. We have estimates that we could have anywhere from 5,000 to 12,000 homeless people in the city of New Orleans. The New Orleans Mission, New Orleans Homeless Mission, is a great organization that's doing wonderful work, and Unity for the Homeless would be another one. And you may be helping somebody who's from your community. We have a lot of people who are not from New Orleans that moved here thinking, that they could get a job, or I won't suggest people were dumped here, but we have a lot of people from a lot of different places around the country, and you may be helping one of your citizens. Maybe we can even fund some bus tickets, and, we'll see. One way.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Morris Davis. My question that I had, and I really appreciate that all of you were really supporting polling, as you say, and that's a great thing. However, I think that there is a fallacy that we do have in our industry, and that is that if you liken a situation to a hospital emergency room, and you told the physician that you've got 1,000 people out there, 300 of them are critical, and 700 of them aren't as critical, that emergency room physician might say we're overloaded. So the point I'm making is, although we have numbers of 70% that say everything's looking better, that may be indeed reflective of their attitude, not necessarily their situation, how do we and how can we help you in terms of communicating that the reality of it is that there's a 37 out there that are really, 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 really hurting, and that you can't really see that if you just look at numbers. If you look at numbers, it looks like 30%, but if you do like the emergency room and you ask someone, what's the level of pain that you feel, that would amplify that 30% dramatically. So the question is, what can we do? And I'm not talking about spin. I'm talking about just an even-handed communication of really what the situation is, so that our data comes a little alive, and then it's better able to communicate, because it's indicative by the mere fact that only 3% of those in the state of Louisiana, we're not even talking about in the country, but in the state of Louisiana, believe that it's not a priority. Then what does that say for the rest of us? And yet, there's still so much yet to be done. Thanks.
Well, I think you really highlight the tension that I alluded to, and I think some of my opening comments. Polling data is subjective, and it is a snapshot in time, as to be juxtaposed from data points that relate the objective reality on the ground. And I think those of us, you do this, and of course we do it as well, as we have to be able to distinguish between the two. Give just an example. When I was in the legislature, I was one of 105 members. I'd be sitting on the House floor. There'd be a hot issue that came up, and my phone would start ringing off the hook. And when I was a very young legislator, I thought that the first 300 phone calls I got represented what everybody in the state. Then I got the idea that there were special interest groups, and all these 300 people have gotten a message from their friend to call Mich, and they gave him my number at my desk. And it took me a little while to figure out, I need to start measuring the intensity of what people are saying to me and the breadth of their opinion. And I know that in polling, you have techniques to measure intensity. How strongly do you feel about that? I think we kind of do this with candidates. Well, what's your second choice? How badly do you feel about this? We're picking this up in polling data now on the Democratic side about Clinton supporters and Obama supporters. Well, if one of them doesn't win now, how do you feel about the other one? 6 months ago, everybody was loving everybody, and everybody's hating on everybody. And hopefully they're going to get back together at some point in time for that side of the aisle. And so to the extent that you can measure more deeply the intensity level of voters, or citizens or people that are there, that could be very, very helpful. Now, that's very different from what the gentleman earlier, Rick, talked about, which is being able to understand what ideas people in communities think are good ideas or good suggestions they may have because they're living it every day that we may not have access to. That's somewhat of a different issue that I would agree with the mayor is very useful information as we go forward to designing strategies for delivering health care education in a particular neighborhood, whether it's in the east or the lower Ninth Ward or Gentilly or wherever that is. That's great stuff that can be very, very helpful to us.
Scott, just real quick, what we need as far as being able to move this recovery to the next level is for you to give us data that delves into that 23% that is still hurting at the significant level and help us to understand the different segments, and if you can extrapolate to get to the citizens who are like those that you sampled and give us an action plan that we can now go reach those citizens, man, I would send you a Christmas card, big time.
All right, the last question right here, because I want to end up with a question for the panelists, but please, go ahead with yours.
Okay, my name is Eileen O'Brien, and I'm a damn Yankee. And a veteran, see, they know what I'm talking about, a veteran of 3 federal statistical agencies. The French Revolution began in a pretty tough neighborhood, not unlike parts of New Orleans. And if King Louis had the privilege of having pollsters and used them, he might have saved himself some trouble. So what do you think the lesson is in terms of making use of polling data and how the French Revolution affected not only Paris, but France and its neighbors in the United States? What did we learn from Katrina and the neighborhood where the bread lines were pretty clear here in New Orleans?
I'm going to give my panelists a second to think about that question. I would say this to you. I'm a damn Yankee, but I came to New Orleans and now I'm a New Orleanian. I suggest you do the same thing. All right, who wants to answer that question? Norman? We give it to the saint.
Do the same thing King Louis did and get the people to revolt.
Well, it may be in the nature of the people that are here in Louisiana arrest. We went through a terrible catastrophe, but there was a degree of, what it showed, a degree of resilience, determination, and faith. And it didn't reach the point where people said, we're just going to turn the city and the state over. It did not reach that point. And I think one description was that we were on our knees, but we weren't on our backs. And that there were people out there, particularly after the first year, after the shock wore off as to what happened to us, who said, well, you can't completely depend upon government. I remember the comment made by Japanese speaker who came to New Orleans after Nagasaki, and he said, you can't depend on government. Now, you need government, but you can't depend on government, and you're going to have to in your own neighborhoods. It has been amazing to see in different neighborhoods in New Orleans how people came together and said, we are communities, we are coming back, and we are coming back, and we're not going to wait for government to do it, we're going to do it ourselves. Now, you can't all do it by oneself because you have to rely on government. And I think people are starting to see, after it took a while, that government is providing the support, but that much of what is going to have to be done and planned and done is going to be done by the people. So the difference is that the people looked at the side of how can we make it better because we paid a big price. And I'll close with this. The mantra, if you will, the code word for us is we're not trying to come back to where we were, because where we were was not where we should have been. We paid a high price in Katrina. We had an epiphany. And now a commitment now, you know, people used to say to you, at least my parents said to me, oh, those good old days. And some people say, oh, well, those good old days before Katrina. They weren't good old days, and we don't want to come back to those days. Our job is to work hard to come back to where we should be, and that's a major challenge, and people are coming to that understanding.
Let me conclude with two quick questions that are simple answers I want from each one of you. One is, what is the single largest challenge we still face in New Orleans? And what is the one message you want this audience to walk away with when they go back to their homes about New Orleans?
I think the single most pressing issue is quality of life issues. Education, public education, healthcare, crime, all those other things. I've said this before, and people up here may hit me as I leave. Believe it or not, the infrastructure is going to get rebuilt. It's been slower than it has been, should have been, but at some point in time it's going to be rebuilt. As will the road home money will finally get through the channels and the bureaucracy, and the money will be in the hands of the people that need it. But the thing that I would leave with you is that there is new life, new energy in New Orleans, and it's civic pride. It's citizens that are engaged for the first time in the quality of life issues. And I've said this publicly, and I'll say it to you again today. In my view, great cities are not great because of government. Austin, San Jose, Birmingham, Alabama, pick the city. They're great because the citizens. And New Orleans has some wonderful, wonderful human beings that are engaged to make the city better. And they're doing it today, and if you don't believe me, look at public education, look at their commitment to crime, to improving crime, look at their commitment to health care. This city will be a model 20 years from now for cities that have made a tremendous recovery and turn as it relates to quality of life issues.
The biggest challenge we have, in my opinion, is surviving another hurricane season and not getting hit with a major storm and allowing the Corps of Engineers to finish the work that they have started. Right now, our city is the best protected it's ever been, probably in its history, but the entire hurricane protection system is still not totally complete. So there are very weak areas of our levee system that need to be shored up, and the money is allocated to do that. Because if another event happens, it will probably erode the optimism and the momentum that we have right now, which I don't know of anything else that could stop that. You know, lack of road home checks or lack of federal or state money or lack of, you know, local input is not going to stop this recovery. It's in motion, it's ingrained, and it's moving forward. So other than a hurricane, I think we're going to be moving to a much higher level. As far as would like for you to go tell the world after you leave here, tell them that New Orleans is okay. Tell them that New Orleans is a city in recovery. Tell them that New Orleans is a city that is a tale of two cities. Downtown is probably as vibrant as it's ever been. The French Quarter is as funky and nasty and everything you ever remembered. The food is wonderful. Harris Casino, you can lose all your money and pay your New Orleans taxes and it's okay. And just tell them that this great American world city is coming back and we're going to be okay. And that we need more people from around the country to come and see about us, as the old folk have said, and see what's really going on here.
I would echo what all the other panelists have said up here. I would say that the first and most important issue is safety and security, which can be broken down into issues that they've talked about: coastal wetland restoration, levees, and then people feeling physically safe from the potential threat of crime. Once people feel safe and secure, then the things that Chairman Powell talked about will kind of kick in. And I, again, adopt what all the panelists have said. I would want you to leave with this notion, though, that what happened in New Orleans was as much about you, America, as it was about us. That we were the canary in the coal mine. If you think that it was just something that happened in New Orleans and it was those folks way down there and this didn't have any relationship to us, America will have missed a very important learning moment. If you want to know who left the people at the convention center or the Superdome or wherever they were left, really America did, when we really kind of got away from some issues that we should have talked about. If you want to know about why the emergency operations system didn't work here, you might want to ask yourself why it doesn't work in New York and why they still can't talk, the firefighters, you know, when somebody's in the subway and somebody's up on the top and they still don't have interoperability. If you want to know why the healthcare delivery system isn't working in the country, the education system isn't. And so this is, in my opinion, the nation's best and most immediate laboratory for change, where we really have the freedom to try different kinds of things, where ideology doesn't necessarily drive the issue, but actually solving real human problems in a way that can actually be taken across the country and used to rebuild all of the American cities. And I like to say that we are probably this nation's best and last hope to probably restore our credibility as a nation nationally and internationally as we try to spread democracy across the globe and tell people how they ought to live. If we can't figure out a way to do it on our homeland, I think our moral authority that we have exercised for many, many years across the nation has been compromised. And the best thing that we can do as a nation is use this as a way to restore that credibility, because the people of New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, Mississippi, Southwest Louisiana, are offering ourselves because we need it and we think America needs it as well. Thank you.
My short response is that we have come to realize, and I use that word advisedly, that this recovery process is going to be a multi-year process. It's going to take 5 to 8 years to get back to where we were. And the biggest problem we had at the very beginning was people were anxious. Why is it taking so long? And when I was not a statesman, I would say, you tell me compared to what? This has never happened in this country on its soil before, so we don't have a model to judge. And we are convinced, and we know now, it's going to take us a while, but we are about it. We are going to not just survive, we're going to be better. And we do hope that this country will come and look at what happened, how we responded, because tomorrow it could be any one of your cities. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, Chairman Powell, Dr. Francis, Lieutenant Governor Mich Landrieu, I have to say, I am proud to call you my friends. I am proud to call you my friends. And I would say to all of you out there, as I came to this great city 10 years ago, when I came to it as a damn Yankee, I came saying, I don't know what I've gotten myself into, and I don't know how long I'll stay here. And Katrina came, and I would say this: New Orleans will always be my home for the rest of my life, because there's no other city in the United States that I know of, that I've lived in, that could lay claim to its own music, its own food, its own architecture, its own language, its own charm. And I would tell you, once it gets in your blood, it never gets out of your blood. And remember, America would not be America without New Orleans. And you wouldn't have come here if you didn't realize what we all realize. This is a gem in our great country. So come back often and enjoy our great city just as we get to enjoy it every day. Please join me in thanking our panelists.